Now, let's put all of this together and talk about customer relationship management. There are many ways how you can define customer relationship management. The one definition I'm using is based on an article in 2005, and it's as follows. Customer relationship is a strategic approach that is concerned with creating improved shareholder value through the development of appropriate relationships with key customers and customer segments. Now, if you look at this definition, you see it is pretty lengthy. So probably we can shorten this a little bit. Creating improved shareholder value essentially means getting rich. That's what we discussed in the introduction, right? And the development of appropriate relationships with key customers and customer segments means treating customers as they deserve it. So in a nutshell, CRM is the art of getting as rich as possible by treating customers as they deserve it. What does this mean? Well, in order to understand what this means, let's take your personal life for a start. Assume you are in the middle of this circle and assume that you have 8 friends: Karen, Bob, Deb, Eva, Fred, Gus, Hal, and Ian. Now, in addition to these 8 friends, you also have a busy life. You have to study, you have other obligations, so you can't spend every day, the entire day with your friends. Let's say, for the sake of argument, you have 8 friends and you have about 16 hours of spare time in any given week. Let's say Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. Well, you have 16 hours, you have 8 friends, so on average, each friend should receive 2 hours of your time. But the problem is, these friends are not all the same. Karen, for example, might be much less enjoyable, much less fun to work with than Fred. But if you want to be fair, this should not matter in your judgment. You spend 2 hours with Fred, 2 hours with Karen, 2 hours with Fred, 2 hours with Karen, and 2 hours with all the others as well. This is what fairness would mean. And this is what means treating every friend in the same way. 16 hours, 8 friends, each person gets 2 hours. But that would not be efficient because the 2 hours you spend with Fred bring you so much more fun and enjoyment than the 2 hours you spend with Karen. So what you will do over time, you will necessarily allocate time away from Karen to have more time for Fred. You will spend 3 hours with Fred and 1 hour with Karen and probably 4 hours with Fred, and 1 week you don't see Karen at all, and it will become Fred, 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 Fred. And probably then once in a while you meet Karen. This means you treat your customers as they deserve it. You treat your friends as they deserve it. The people who bring you a lot of fun and who you like to be around get a disproportionate amount of your time, of your resources compared to other friends. And firms do exactly the same thing because firms have some customers that are more valuable than others. Take an airline like Lufthansa, for example. Lufthansa has probably tens of millions of customers, but there are only very few customers who travel a lot. There may be people who spend $50,000, $100,000 every year on Lufthansa flights because they may travel 50, 100, 150 times a year. And there are other customers who probably only spend $500 or $1,000 per year on Lufthansa because they only travel once a year. You can put these customers into a hierarchy depending on how much value they bring to you, from the top with the most valuable ones to the bottom where they are the least valuable ones. And what firms usually try to do is they try to treat those customers at the top, the best customers, in the best possible way. And there are many, many examples of this. The airline industry is a very good example because you will see that depending on the amount of flights you do, this determines the type of level you have in an airline loyalty program, for example, and this will determine the way you get treated, from having either to queue up like everyone else, which you see in the left-hand corner of this slide, to having access to special lounges and probably even special services and a special type of terminal. Now, every company likes to think about this because every company likes to treat every customer as a king and to invest disproportionate amount of money into the customers that are most valuable. However, what you need to see is that if you have a certain amount of marketing budget that is fixed and you decide to spend more money on some customers, you necessarily have to spend less money on other customers. It's like in the example before. If you only have 16 hours and you decide to spend 10 hours with Fred, then the remaining 6 hours need to be allocated over all the remaining 7 friends, and every one of the other one gets less than the 2 hours they initially would have gotten. This means that if you want to treat some customers very well, you necessarily need to treat other customers less well. And the most extreme version is what you find here, and an example out of a letter from 2007 from Sprint Nextel, where Sprint Nextel decided to fire about 1,000 customers that they considered to be unprofitable. These 1,000 customers had called the call center a disproportionate amount of time. They had constant requests that the company was not necessarily able to fulfill. And in 2007, Sprint Nextel decided to cancel the contracts of these customers. You call this unprofitable customer abandonment. And we talk much more about this in a later session, under which condition it makes sense and why it might make sense. But for the moment, I want you to see that these are 2 sides of the same coin. If you want to treat some customers disproportionately well or invest disproportionate resources into them, you necessarily have to invest less in other customers if your budget is fixed, because the money has to come from somewhere. Now, in some cases, the customers where you have to save money probably also were kind of abusive to begin with. There's an example here that you will find in the New York Post about a man in China who purchased a first-class ticket for a flight simply to use the lounge the entire day and then to rebook his ticket at the end of the day. And he did this a couple of 100 times. So yes, some customers probably show behavior that is so extreme and so abusive that treating them a little bit less well, or probably even firing them, as in the example of Sprint Nextel, makes sense. In other cases, it might actually not be the customer who is at fault, it is the company who is at fault. There's a very nice example about the AA Airpass program, and you can find many, many videos on this on YouTube, for example. Just go on YouTube and check it out. The AA Airpass program was a program that American Airlines introduced in the 80s, where they offered unlimited first-class travel for your entire life for a fixed fee of $250,000 for one person and $350,000 for 2 people. And of course, if you offer unlimited first-class travel to any person, there's always some people who will abuse that, who travel a disproportionate amount of time, who probably give the second ticket away for people, who probably even sell the second ticket at a price that is cheaper than what other people would have needed to pay directly had they bought the ticket from you. These examples are supposed to show you that occasionally it is the customer who is at fault because they show behavior that is so extreme that makes them unprofitable. Occasionally, it is the company who is at fault because they provide procedures or develop products that simply do not make sense. It doesn't really matter, and we talk more about whose fault it is to be unprofitable in this later section. But it is important for you to see at this point that if you want to treat some customers very well, which means giving them more money than they would get otherwise, more time than the 2 hours your friends would have gotten on average, then necessarily some other customers need to be treated less well. And this is what I mean when I say develop appropriate relationships. Now, this is the key cornerstone of CRM. If you are not willing to treat customers differently depending on the profit they bring to your firm, then I am not sure whether you can do CRM. For example, in the next session, we will talk a lot about how you can calculate the value of a customer and how you can find out who is on the top of the pyramid and who is on the bottom. But why would you want to know who is on the top and who is on the bottom if at the end of the day, you try to treat every customer in the same way anyway? So this is a really, really fundamental element. The other elements that are part of this definition are add-ons once you have accepted this first step. CRM unites the potential of relationship marketing and IT to create profitable long-term relationships with customers and other stakeholders. If you have 10, 20, 30 million customers, you need IT in order to manage those customers. But simply having IT does not make you more efficient if you don't know what you are going to do. So very often companies believe that by buying a CRM software, they do CRM, but this is simply not true. You do CRM if you have the right mindset. And if you have the right mindset, IT can help you to do things faster and more efficiently. But if you're not knowing what you're going to do, then no IT in the world is able to help you. CRM allows to use data and information to understand customers and co-create value with them. This is where CRM relates very closely to the concepts of big data and artificial intelligence, which we talk about in the next session, because in many cases, CRM means that you try to understand the customer in a very granular way and adapt the way you treat the customer accordingly. And finally, CRM requires cross-functional integration of different departments in your firm. And we talk about this cross-functional integration for an entire session in a couple of weeks. Now, the question that you can ask is, why is this so important? Why is it so important to treat customers differently? And the reason why it is so important is because the value that customers bring to a firm can be vastly different. What you see here on this slide is the outcome of a study that I did a couple of years ago. We took a bank and we split the customer base of the bank into 20-something segments. Then we calculated the profitability of each segment and we divided that profitability by the average profitability of the firm. For example, you see that segment 20 has a relative profitability or contribution index of 9, which means the customer in segment 20 are 9 times more profitable than the average customer would be. If you work with this average profitability or with this contribution index, you naturally have 3 groups. Those who are above 1, so they are more profitable than average. Those who are between 0 and 1, they are less profitable than average, but they are still profitable. And those who are less than 0, which means they are unprofitable. And you see that in the case that we had, it was about a third, 36, 36, and 26%. I don't want to talk about a third, and we talk more about this unprofitability in a later section. But the point of this slide is there is huge difference. There is huge heterogeneity between customers. There's a very, very big difference between the customers in segment 20 who are highly profitable and the customers in segment 8 who are probably unprofitable. And because there's such huge difference, like going back to the very first example, the difference between Fred and Karen, it makes sense to treat customers differently because, well, they deserve to be treated differently. Now, why is CRM so important these days? Well, in a nutshell, CRM is so important these days because out of a multitude of reasons, any given marketing budget that you have brings you less far than it probably used to bring you. What do I mean by this? Well, first of all, over the past decade or two, customers have changed a lot. They become more value conscious, they become more informed, they become more diverse. They become, in general, more demanding. 10, 20 years ago, it was probably okay to wait for 10 minutes in a line in a supermarket. Today, this is no longer okay for most people. But if customers become more demanding and more difficult to deal with, what this means is you need to invest more money into keeping them happy. If we assume that your budget is fixed, you cannot simply invest more money into everyone because otherwise, where would the money come from if the budget is fixed? So the only choice that you have is to invest that more money to keep the customers happy only into those customers who deserve to get that money, which are the profitable ones. We have the same in terms of changes in the marketplace. Markets become increasingly competitive. It is increasingly hard to differentiate based on product quality. In an earlier session, I said that if you're standing in front of a shelf of washing powder, probably one brand can actually be differentiating by being technically better. Nowadays, this is becoming increasingly hard. Every brand that you buy in the supermarket is very good technically. All shampoos are very good. All washing powders are very good. All orange juices are very good. It's very hard to differentiate based on product quality, which means you need to differentiate based on other factors. There is less focus on tangible products, which means you need to invest into loyalty programs, into better service, into probably an influencer marketing campaign. All of this costs money. And as before, this means if the budget is fixed, you need to decide who you want to invest the money in. And finally, the marketing function has tremendously changed over the past 2 decades. Marketing is nowadays increasingly a very data-driven and information-driven function, which means you have lots of information available about your consumers. And in order to use this information in the best possible way, you need to treat customers on an individual basis as much as possible. And this is where CRM comes in. And this is What brings me also to the topic of artificial intelligence, which is the last part of this first session. So to summarize, what is CRM? CRM is the art of getting as rich as possible. Remember the introduction, that's our focus, maximizing our shareholder value by treating people as they deserve it, because not every customer deserves to be treated perfectly. And it is important nowadays because customers become increasingly complicated to deal with, which means the marketing budget that we have no longer brings us that far, and we have to decide who we invest the money in and who we don't invest the money.